everyone. So I'm Anjni Joyner. I am an associate professor of emergency medicine at Duke University. I also am the medical director for our county-based EMS agency, Durham County EMS. And I also have a joint appointment with Duke National University of Singapore. I have no conflicts of interest for this talk, but as I look at this beautiful view outside and see this beautiful snow falling, it makes me think a little bit about what happens in my city when it snows, which is this. This was from about 10 years ago. We got, I believe it was 2 inches of snow, and it was chaos. So we went for 3 years without snowing, and this year it snowed twice, and fortunately we had no recurrence of vehicles on fire. So this is where I am from. North Carolina is on the eastern seaboard. It's considered part of the American South. And Durham County is right here, kind of in the central region of the state. Our population is 340,000, and it's actually one of the fastest growing areas in the United States, as well as the state of North Carolina. So a little bit about my city. Durham is a city that is deeply rooted within the tobacco industry. And you can see that here with a Lucky Strike tower, and this is a Lucky Strike water cooler. The American Tobacco Corporation was one of the largest corporations in the United States, or actually in the world, in the 1880s, 1900s, and it was actually housed in Durham, North Carolina. And we have a large campus called the American Tobacco Campus, which is now mixed-use residential, restaurants, commercial. But now our city has tried to rebrand ourselves, and we are now the City of Medicine, which is due to a large university being in Durham. Duke University is a large academic research institution, and Duke Health is a large component of the healthcare that we provide in the state. And then we also have a lot of biotechnology, startup businesses, pharmaceutical companies in the south of Durham, and a special campus called the Research Triangle Park, which is several acres and over 100 different companies. So to pivot a little bit about to EMS, this if you know EMS, you've probably heard this saying before. If you've seen one EMS system, you've seen one EMS system. And this holds true I've done a lot of international EMS work, and I feel like this holds true globally, and especially in the United States, where you have such variation in EMS care delivery. So you have hospital-based EMS, you have fire-based EMS, critical care, ground critical care, flight critical care. This is my own agency, Durham County, and you have private agencies. So there's just a lot of variation in how EMS is structured, but also how EMS protocols are put into place locally. So in North Carolina, and actually across the US, we have state governs the scope of practice. So each state has a defined scope of practice for all of the EMS practitioners within that state. And then the medical director can refine that scope of practice on a local level. So the kind of ceiling is the state scope of practice, and then the local medical director can choose to reduce some of the scope of practice. EMS practitioners are credentialed at the state level and also at the local level. So anyone who works within my agency has to be cleared to function medically under my supervision. And sorry, just to back up, so we have 3 different levels. Essentially, this holds true across the United States, although there are some variations. But in North Carolina, we have technically 4, but and the emergency medical responder is kind of the lowest of the lowest level. But we have emergency medical technicians, which is our EMTs. They typically require several weeks of education and minimal clinical time. Advanced emergency medical technicians is usually a few months of training. And then our paramedic is the highest level of certification, probably similar to how nurses function in Sweden, usually about 18 months to a year of training. So this is my EMS system. So in North Carolina, it's a little unique in how we structure EMS. So there are 100 counties in North Carolina. Yep. So we don't have nurses. Yeah, nurses will usually work on critical care ambulances, but for 911 response, we don't really have nurses functioning in the field. So paramedics will kind of replace the nurse role for what you do here. So 100 counties in North Carolina, and each county has one medical director, and that medical director oversees all EMS care within that county. So I oversee 911, so our Durham Emergency Communication Center, all of the fire departments within our county, which are our first responders, so City of Durham, and then we have 3 volunteer fire departments. And then also our EMS Transport Agency, which is the only paramedic level of service within the county. Durham County EMS is considered a third service, which is kind of a unique title because you consider the first 2 services fire and EMS, or fire and police. And so EMS is kind of the third service, so it's governed by the county. It's very confusing. I'm happy to go into more detail if you guys have questions. So some of the additional services that our EMS agency offers, we have special operations. So we have biological and chemical emergency response team, or BCERT team, and the hazardous devices unit, which works with our sheriff's office. We offer a tactical emergency medical services team that works with our police department, a dive team, which also does urban search and rescue, and then this is a little bit adjacent to the agency, but we have an unarmed police response called the Durham Heart Team, which is meant to reduce the number of armed police responses to 911 calls. We also have a community paramedic program. So when this program was initially developed in 2017, the 3 focuses of the foci of the program were behavioral emergencies, familiar faces, so those patients who call, every day for 911 services, and then opioid use disorder and opioid overdoses. Since then, we've expanded into other areas and other needs that our community had. So we now do vaccines for homeless individuals, as well as those who are homebound, who just can't leave their house to go to a pharmacy or to a clinic to get a COVID vaccine or a flu vaccine. We also have a focus on falls, as we have a rapidly aging population and see falls quite frequently within our service. And then we also have started doing hospice referrals, which is for a lot of our familiar faces. They're calling because they're just not connected to the healthcare system like they should be, and many of them are actually eligible for hospice care. So a little bit about our opioid overdose response. So this initially started kind of with 2 main goals. We wanted to be able to provide naloxone kits to our community. So we are distributing naloxone to members of the community who may have experienced an overdose, or family members who happen to be there, or friends or whoever. And then we were also doing post-overdose response team visits. So PORT team is called a post-overdose response team. So after a patient experienced an overdose, we try to connect with that individual within 24 to 48 hours to try to connect them to care, to give them naloxone and other community resources. So this was our approach towards the rising opioid epidemic in the U.S. It wasn't working very well. So this is our data from 2018 to 2023. So we had a pretty sharp rise in our in our encounters for suspected opioid overdoses. Some months we were seeing upwards of 100 or more patients who were experiencing overdoses. But average before then was around 30 or less. So our trend was really mirroring what we were seeing on a national level. And I'm sure that most of you have heard about the opioid crisis in the US and how challenging it has been, but this is our national numbers. So we also see this steep rise here up to in 2022, we had over 80,000 deaths that were attributable to opioid use. And you'll see that there was a very specific reason why there was such a sharp increase. So historically, the opioid crisis has been described to have 3 waves. So wave 1 was here in the green. That's attributable to this rise in prescription opioid overdoses. So doctors were incentivized to prescribe opioids, and patients became addicted and would either get pills illegally or, finagle their way to get a prescription, and they were overdosing on these. You'll see that this wave has also decreased recently. The second wave is this purple one, wave 2, and this was from a rise in heroin overdose deaths, so more illicit street drug use. And also, this is decreasing of more recent. Wave 3 is the blue one, and this is due to, you'll see it kind of mirrors what we see on a local level and nationally, but this is a rise due to synthetic opioids and primarily fentanyl. More recently, we've started to describe a fourth wave, and this fourth wave of overdoses is fentanyl plus stimulants, and this is mostly due to the contaminated drug supply and unintentional overdoses from drugs that have been laced with fentanyl. And so this is more data from North Carolina, looking at fentanyl positive deaths in North Carolina and seeing what other substances were on board. So we're seeing a lot of methamphetamines, alcohol, other opioids, prescription drugs. But this, I think, speaks to some of the challenges that we've had with not just polypharmacy, because there are some people who intentionally will take multiple medications, but a lot of this is unintentional as well. So back to North Carolina. This is opioid overdose deaths in 2023. Durham County is right here in the middle, and you can see that we have one of the highest rates of overdose deaths in the state. Although sadly, much of that applies to the majority of the state. With other states, we a little bit on the higher side, but recently, the most recent numbers that came out just a few weeks ago, we've actually decreased our opioid overdose deaths by like almost 50%, or not almost 50%, sorry, by a significant number. I don't know the exact number, but they're on the decline, and I'll get to that. So this is, again, more data from our city or from our county. So the illicit opioid overdose rate is still remaining pretty high. It's starting to level off a little bit, but still pretty high. And then our number of opioid overdose deaths was still on the increase in 2023. So what we were doing wasn't really making much of an impact. At least we felt like it wasn't making an impact. And so we needed to think about this problem a little bit differently. So this is the rate of non-transports after we encountered patients with opioid overdoses. Yeah. Yeah. You know, that's an excellent question, and I actually haven't been able to find any good data on like morbidity. Most of the data focuses on emergency department visits for overdoses or deaths, but they really don't speak to long-term disability. And it's a question that I've had that I haven't really been able to find good data for, but that's a great thought. Yeah. And it actually expands beyond that too, because not only is there the chance for permanent disability in these patients, but it impacts their family members, it impacts their children, and so there's a wider arching impact from opioid overdose in general, or opioid use in general. So a quarter of our patients that we were administering naloxone to or treating for an overdose were refusing transport. So this is huge, because this is a significant population that's not receiving help otherwise. They're not going to the emergency department, they're calling 911, and they're not going to clinics and seeking treatment on their own. This was the 1-year mortality for patients in 7 counties in North Carolina after encountering EMS and being given naloxone. So 15%. 15% of patients were dying within a year after they received naloxone by EMS. So a pretty substantial problem. There's a cost issue. I think for this, it's a very multifactorial cause as to the refusals. A lot of it is like fear. They're fearing law enforcement is often dispatched to these calls as well. So they're afraid they're going to get into trouble. They're just not interested in treatment. They've had negative interactions with the health system before. There's a lot of stigma around drug use. So I think cost is probably on the lower list of concerns that they have, but it's definitely a factor. And then the 15% mortality compared to like STEMI post 1 year mortality for STEMI patients is like 7%. So it's pretty significant. Okay, so it's around this time that we started to see ED-based medication for opioid use disorder programs. So this was a landmark article from Gail D'Onofrio at Yale University, and she did a randomized controlled trial comparing three groups of, or patients randomized to three different groups. One received like usual care. They were given a pamphlet for resources in the community. The second group was given a pamphlet, plus they had like a social worker come talk to them and try to get them to go to a clinic. And then the third group was given all of those things plus buprenorphine. They were initiated on buprenorphine treatment in the emergency department. And they had a 78% retention in treatment in 3 days. This quickly took off, and many emergency departments across the US, not just academic institutions, but also community hospitals, started their own ED buprenorphine programs. And like a lot of what we do in the emergency department, we try to translate this to the EMS setting. But I am going to give you guys a really brief overview of buprenorphine pharmacology, because I know most emergency physicians really weren't familiar with this. I may be off mark here, but I certainly wasn't very familiar with this treatment until it started in our emergency department. But just for a brief review, buprenorphine is a partial agonist at the mu opioid receptor. So unlike full agonists like methadone, fentanyl, oxycodone, it only has a partial effect. So there's a ceiling effect to respiratory depression. So you can give up to like 98 milligrams of buprenorphine and you really won't see any respiratory depression unless they have like an underlying condition like severe COPD or CHF exacerbation. It does not give patients the euphoria that you would typically get with a full agonist, but you still get the analgesic effects, and it controls the cravings that patients experience when they're withdrawing from opioids. The second property of buprenorphine that makes it a really excellent drug to treat opioid use disorder is that it has a high affinity for the mu opioid receptor. So it binds very tightly to that receptor. And if a patient tries to take heroin or fentanyl after they've already taken buprenorphine, it's not really going to make much of a difference. They're not really going to get high, or they'll have like a much more attenuated response. And so this really helps with some positive reinforcement. But that's kind of a double-edged sword, because if they've recently taken a full opioid agonist and then they're given buprenorphine, that buprenorphine is going to kick that full opioid agonist off of the receptor, and that patient's going to go into a pretty severe precipitated withdrawal. And then the third property is that it has a pretty rapid onset, less than an hour, and a fairly long duration of action, up to 24 hours. So this makes it really ideal for once or twice daily dosing. So a lot of people started doing this in the field. So they're getting their paramedics to administer buprenorphine. And so two of the leaders in this area were Gene Hearn, who's out in California, and Jerry Carroll in New Jersey. And they started training some of their medics to provide buprenorphine given their increasing numbers of opioid overdoses. So we decided, why don't we try this in our own system? So this was our traditional approach to opioid overdose patients. We get a call. That patient's either dead on scene, we transport them to an emergency department, or we have alternate destinations, so we can transport patients to like behavioral health urgent care or recovery centers, but that's pretty rare. Or that patient's going to refuse transport. So we wanted to expand upon this model and add treatment as an option for these patients. So this was our process map when we started this program. EMS responds to a possible overdose or a patient who is experiencing withdrawal. We do our usual advanced life support treatment. We administer naloxone as needed. Our protocol is to titrate naloxone to respiratory drive. We don't try to wake up these patients. We let the hospital kind of manage that piece of it, but it's a danger to our crews to wake up the patient fully. If the patient meets criteria for MOUD, or medication for opioid use disorder, and agrees to treatment, we start down this pathway. So we did a buprenorphine induction, and that was with one of our specially trained community paramedics, or we trained about 18 MAT medics. At the time it was called medication for medication-assisted treatment, MAT. And so we trained 18 paramedics to be able to provide this service. And then we provide maintenance dosing up to 7 days. So we meet with that patient every single day, up to 7 days, until we enroll them into a treatment program in a clinic, and then the clinic takes over. So sounds like a great idea, right? We also received funding for a peer support specialist. So a peer support specialist is someone who has lived experience in opioid use disorder. They're, formerly a user of opioids, and now they are off drugs and are able to work with our crews and kind of speak to a patient in a way that we can't otherwise, because they can really connect with a patient. And then we partnered with a number of treatment programs in our area. We were also able to provide patients with a rideshare voucher for their first visit. And this was all through grant funding. This was our initial protocol. EMS is very protocolized, I know, here as well as in the US. So we had a number of exclusion criteria. Our initial treatment was 16 milligrams plus an additional 16 milligrams for a total of 32 milligrams. And then our treatment days 2 to 7 were 8 and 8 milligrams. And we're just changing our protocols for this upcoming year, and we're increasing this to 16 just because we're seeing a lot of patients who just can't make it through the 24 hours without a second dose. So despite all this planning, our program was not that successful at the onset. This is our first 6 months of data. We only had 6 patients enrolled in our program. So we went back to the drawing board. We did a lot of internal discussions with our crews and tried to kind of do basically a qualitative analysis of what some of the issues were and why people weren't getting enrolled. So we found that there were a lot of patients with with overdoses, but no opioid use disorder. So these are those patients who were unintentionally overdosing from, fentanyl-laced cocaine or whatnot. And then we also have a pretty large unhoused or unsheltered population, and a lot of the homeless shelters in our area would not allow for storage of buprenorphine. So even if we were able to connect a patient with a clinic, they received a prescription, they couldn't stay in their homeless shelter because they wouldn't let them store the medication there. There's a lot of stigma around drug use. And then we were also having difficulty engaging patients. Some of the reports that I was getting from our EMS crews is that they encounter a patient before they could even have the conversation. The patients ripped out their IVs and they're running away. So ways that we tried to address some of these issues. So we've been distributing naloxone kits, not just with our CPs, but all of our units. So we made sure that we had enough naloxone kits for every single ambulance to carry several so that they can increase distribution. And then we were also distributing fentanyl tests as well. And for unsheltered population, we've had a lot of conversations with our community partners and alternate housing resources. And fortunately, those conversations have really progressed to the point where the largest shelter in the county is now allowing for 30-day storage of buprenorphine, which is great. And then for difficulty engaging patients, we did agency-wide training on stigma. We increased focus on our post-overdose response team follow-ups, especially with the peer support specialist. And then we did advertising. So we created pamphlets and we handed them out to community partners who might encounter patients who have substance use disorders. And we got a number of referrals for patients who saw our pamphlet and wanted to get started on treatment. Some of the internal challenges that we faced. So logistically, when we first started this program, we had a limited number of buprenorphine. So we only had it on our community paramedic vehicles and our supervisor vehicles. And then there was a lack of available trained medics. So we only had 18 MAT medics across 4 shifts. And so you might encounter a patient who really wanted to start on treatment. Okay, so now we have to wait for an MAT medic to get here. Oh, and we also have to wait for a supervisor to get here with the buprenorphine. And patients just didn't want to wait that long. So it was a real barrier. And then timing as well. So we realized that the immediate time period after overdose was just not ideal for a lot of patients. They had just suffered a near-death experience. They were really not interested in having this conversation. So we then decided to stock all of our ambulances with buprenorphine. We trained all of our paramedics to be able to administer buprenorphine. And then we also got some operational support for increasing our scene times and requested additional community paramedics through the county leadership. And we have been able to get 2 more community paramedics, which was great. And then with the timing again, we continue to advertise throughout the community, and then we've increased our post-overdose response team follow-ups. And the additional community paramedics really helps with that too, because now we have more people. So I think underlying all of this too is a real shift in how we see this problem. So I think, previously the traditional model of emergency of EMS is we treat and we transport to a hospital, or if they refuse, we refuse them. And I think it's really reframing this concept that it's a community-based problem and we are part of the community. And everyone has ownership of this problem and the solution as well. And what I've heard from a lot of my paramedics, as well as paramedics in other programs that have implemented MOUD programs, is that they just felt so helpless before because they kept treating the same patients over and over again and they couldn't do anything. And now we've empowered them with a way to treat these patients and to truly make a difference. One of the, I think, most satisfying outcomes from this program was two actually. So one was a pregnant woman who one of our field crews ended up starting on buprenorphine. And then she was so pleased with the program that she referred her partner. And then her partner ended up referring his parents. So it was like a domino effect. And, we potentially saved 5 lives from that one encounter. And I think that our crews who were experiencing a lot of burnout from the opioid crisis really appreciated this additional tool in their toolbox to be able to offer. But it does take really addressing that stigma aspect of it. And a lot of our paramedics or EMTs, they not only have experience with opioid overdoses and opioid use disorder on a daily basis on the job, but they may have had family members or friends who are suffering from substance use disorders, and they have just been so burned out from dealing with that they have generated a lot of stigma. Like, this is a problem that is a moral failing. I'm not going to be able to fix this. And I think this program has really allowed them to turn their views on substance use disorder around. And then just integrating into the community. So we've been able to integrate into the emergency department. So we have this program in the emergency department, but these patients often end up in the hallway and then they leave because they start withdrawing and they don't care anymore and they don't want to be there. And so we've now offered our services to the ED. And so the emergency department can refer patients to us and we'll drive to the patient and provide them treatment. So we did a lot of targeted education, making this protocolized so that it's part of their job, I think, really pushed forward the program. Adding the peer support specialists because I think their perspective is very unique. And then we do our best to highlight the success stories so that people feel like they understand that they're making a difference. So this is what our new process map looks like. So we still treat ALS as needed. If a patient meets criteria, any medic can now do a buprenorphine induction. And then our community paramedics are still primarily initiating the referrals just because they have more time to do so. But any medic can do the bridge dosing. And then with these changes, we saw a pretty significant increase in the number of buprenorphine inductions that we were doing. So our program started in May of 2023. And I think the biggest change was really increasing the availability of buprenorphine on the ambulances and increasing the training for our paramedics. And unfortunately, I don't have 2025 data, but it's pretty similar. We've stayed on a similar trajectory. So what our program looks like today, we have now 8 clinics that we refer to, so opioid treatment programs, office-based opioid treatment clinics. That's what OTP and OBOT stands for. We've had 4 patients who have experienced precipitated withdrawal, and one of them didn't tell our paramedic that they had taken codeine because they didn't realize that it was an opioid. And then 2 of them were actually just not forthcoming about recent fentanyl use because they were so desperate to get started on treatment. They just didn't tell the truth. And so it's just really sad to kind of hear that. They really want to get on treatment, but they just can't stop themselves from using for 12 hours, which is our cutoff. And then one of the precipitated withdrawal, I don't know, we don't know what happened. So our next steps, we are continuing to expand our community paramedic program. We are looking at some long-acting injectables for opioid use disorder, which will reduce some of the burden on our community paramedics for having to follow up with the patient daily and potentially reducing the number of patients who drop off of our program. And then we're also potentially partnering with some addiction medicine specialists at Duke and looking at treatment of alcohol use disorder. And that is all I have. Any questions?
paramedics only happy about this, or have you heard anything about that? Maybe it's more job for them to follow up on this.
Yeah, that's a great question. So initially, I think there was a lot of concern that it would increase scene times. And so from an operational perspective, they were like, we don't want our paramedics on scene for like an hour and a half. But that really hasn't stood up. Most of these encounters take less than an hour. And it's actually faster than transporting a patient, turning around at the hospital and getting back into service. Most of the apprehension around the program was, why are we treating this community, which is really sad. But in our most recent continuing education session with our paramedics, I presented some of our recent data, and one of our longstanding paramedics kind of raised his hand. He's like, hey, I want to say something. And I was like, oh God, what is he going to say? And he said, I just want to tell you, I was really skeptical of this program when we first started it, but having seen how it's changed lives, I have completely turned around my way of thinking. And that was just really heartening to hear that it's not only making a difference in the community, but making a difference with my paramedics as well. Yeah, so as of now, this program is free for our community. It's funded by some federal funding as well as some state funding. When those funds run out, it will probably end up being a county, funded by the county. So with the opioid epidemic, there were a lot of lawsuits in the U.S. Against these pharmaceutical companies that were pushing for doctors to prescribe opioids, and each state received a massive amount of money specifically to treat opioids. And so we have some opioid settlement funds that will kind of fill in once our grant funding completes, and that funding lasts for 18 years. So I think from a funding perspective, we're really good, and we really want to make this low barrier care so that our patients are not burdened by payments. Most of the clinics that we refer to will offer either free buprenorphine for uninsured patients because they're also receiving funding and they can do that, or low cost care.
Yeah. Are there similar programs in other states?
Yeah, so the two states that I spoke of, California and New Jersey, they have programs, but as there are differences in EMS systems, their programs are structured differently. So they actually don't do the bridge dosing. So they just treat once in the field, and then they immediately refer to a hospital. So it's interesting to see how these programs are structured. And I think that has to do with some legal aspects in their states. But there are a number of states that are putting these programs up now. In the last 2 years, this has really exploded. In the last year, in North Carolina alone, there have been 25 programs. Not all of them allow all of their paramedics to treat, so I think we're a bit unique in that because we had the funding and we were able to do so. But I think a lot of them do the community paramedic model, and so only a select number of patients or paramedics can provide the treatment.
Subject specifically, but more generally about the physician's role in the physician in the pre-hospital environment.
Yeah.
Is there a role beyond the directorship overseeing? Do you have to have physicians seeing patients outside of hospitals?
Yeah, and we were actually having this discussion earlier. So I have a response vehicle. So we have 3 medical directors for Durham County. So I have 2 under me, and I just gave the vehicle to them because I have too much office work that I need to do. But we go out in the field probably a few times a month just to ride out and to have some FaceTime with our crews. And if you get there first, you're doing treatment. In larger cities, they will have dedicated ambulance or dedicated response units for physicians that are built into the schedule. Those are usually pretty large cities, not one my size. But I'm trained to work in the field. I can do procedures in the field. We have a fully stocked ambulance. It's just not a routine part of what we do.
Fellowship that you have to do.
Yeah. So there is a specific fellowship. You don't have to do a fellowship to be an EMS physician, but it's moving towards the larger cities only employing physicians who have completed a fellowship or who are board certified in EMS. So all of the major cities in the U.S. and even mid-sized cities like mine will have an EMS trained physician. Because there's just so many nuances to pre-hospital care that you need a better understanding. And the EMS boards are relatively new. I think 2015 or 2016 is when it became an official subspecialty. So it's still fairly new. And there's a lot of people who were able to grandfather in because they've had the experience. They've been doing this role for years. And so if someone who didn't have the experience wanted to jump into like a medical director role in like New York City or something, that probably wouldn't happen. But if you wanted to, like go to Podunk County, North Carolina, you'd probably be okay. Great questions.
Do you have the same thing for more wilderness kind of medicine? So where you have longer, so it's not a big population, but you have longer distances, and you might need more of a physician input to stabilize the patient in transport. Do you also have these kind of physicians?
Yeah, so not in my area. My area is pretty urban, so we don't have like a whole lot of need for wilderness medicine. But in some areas out in the western part of the state, up North Carolina, it's very mountainous, and there's a national park, and so I don't think they have any dedicated physician response for that area. But out west, in the western U.S., they do have, like New Mexico has a very strong EMS program, and they have physicians who will staff national parks and will staff more of these rural areas, and that it's more common for them to provide care in the field too, because they're often the first there. I think I was just listening to a story the other day about one of the New Mexico physicians like doing a field thoracostomy and resuscitating a patient. So there's a lot of opportunity in more rural areas. And for wilderness medicine as a specialty, it's not a board certified specialty. It is a fellowship that some people will do, but most people who work in EMS in a rural setting or in a wilderness setting usually go the EMS route to work there. Yeah. Any other questions? Thank you so much for your time and your attention. Yeah, good question.